Through the winding paths and crevices of the infinite expanse called the internet hides countless undiscovered media, from long abandoned websites to concept art of incomplete projects. The internet acts as both an archive and a temporary morgue for ideas. I say temporary because people have made entire careers off discovering and creating creepypastas out of obscure, forgotten media. And I, of course, embrace it wholeheartedly. As a peruser of random things, I, a dopamine slave, have used Twitter as a beginner's gateway into the abyss of those weird findings. Recently, I've run into some artists that seem to play with normal, everyday things in interesting ways. And since I follow so many Japanese artists, I find myself in an untapped web of niche bubbles. Today, I wanted to compile 3 artists I liked into a video to look at. So, let's begin. Oh yeah, and the footage at the beginning has nothing to do with the video. I just thought it looked cool. It's a nice vibe. Anyways, let's go! We'll start pretty innocent and work our way up. The first peculiar Twitter artist I came across calls themselves Tsunotsuno. At a glance, it looks like they work with inflatables of anime girls. I remember seeing these for the first time and was like, holy crap, how'd they get permission for that? But then I learned that they aren't real. Tsuno does 3D art and uses real photos they've taken to edit on their models. Man, do they look really real to me though. Or maybe I'm just gullible. I mean, the way the lighting reflects off its surface, the little imperfections like with the folds and wrinkles around certain parts, and the fabric or material of these things seem believable enough to touch. They actually remind me of Thanksgiving float parades, except for weebs. Yeah, I don't know. I just find the look of these things to be so fascinating. They kind of look like anime mascots, except absurdly big, but they don't come off as like goofy or off-putting per se. As for the photos themselves, I actually like how all these pictures take place at night. I think it being dark kind of gives the whole picture a unique feel that's a little alien, but in a good way. After digging a little bit deeper into Tsuno's works, I discovered something pretty interesting. Tsuno's earlier, traditional 2D drawings look a lot like their 3D inflatable counterpart. The rounder faces and tubular limbs, the kind of hot dog-like fingers and moe face, you can see directly downstream where their more recent art came from. It feels like their 3D art is just an extension of their 2D art, and that transition between the dimensions works perfectly with Tsuno's art style. As someone completely ignorant to the ins and outs of things like Blender, Unreal Engine, or Autodesk, I'd say that this ignorance makes creative works and art in general seem that much more magical. I have zero clue how Tsuno edited this massive inflatable into the foreground without any obvious blemishes to my untrained eyes, in a video no less. Not peeking behind the curtain means I can enjoy the weirdness and be in awe. I've heard people express that learning how a craft works ruins their experience of it, so I'll purposely not do that. Despite not being real, creative curiosities like Tsunotsuno makes me wonder what else weird convincing things are going to be put out in the world. Only time will tell. The second Twitter artist I ran into does more obviously fictitious drawings, but they have their own spin on reality versus fiction. It's also not anime, but I don't care, we're rolling with it. Makes these winding, twisting monsters that cause chaos everywhere they go. Bags of meat lined with eyes and teeth, skeletons with long overgrown limbs, and colossal beasts preying on people. The nightmare fuel of these paintings look horrifying. On top of that, In's art style is extremely realistic. While the Japanese civilians in these paintings seem normal, this normalness is, of course, heavily contrasted by the monstrosities. Generally speaking, I find these paintings unnerving, in a good way. The way that these creatures menacingly pose, towering over those around it, kind of remind me of Gantz. Looking past the horror of these monsters, something thematically consistent you might notice would be the law enforcement's engagement with them. Realistically, if something inhuman actually plopped itself into our lives and attacked people, the average person would turn to the police or government to take them down. And In displays how that would look. In a cool way, some of these paintings tell a little story about how the law enforcement engages with and captures the monsters they run into. Funnily enough, I feel like I don't see much art of police going up against the paranormal, despite being the very people who'd actually have to face off with them. The last cool thing I wanted to mention with Ian's art was how Japanese some of these settings are, as well as its monsters. There's some basic things like the surrounding architecture and the rural landscapes, all being very detailed and Japanese. But as for the monsters, it's clear that these creatures were inspired by the yokai, or the folklore in Japan as well, which makes it uniquely its own. These naturally are not designs we see anywhere in the West, and it got me thinking. There are some basic primal fears humans have as a collective, but how humans wrestle with that fear in art, I find very fascinating. Ian's drawing just got me wondering not only how death, darkness, fire, and other concepts enter a culture's artistic vernacular, but also how they come to look the way that they do and feel in stories or paintings. Yeah, I don't know. Just food for thought, inspired by Ian's ominous art. The last Twitter artist I'm going to talk about has essentially created the basis or blueprint for an entire video game. Not only does their world seem fleshed out with protagonists, antagonists, and goals, but they've perfectly nailed the theoretical gameplay. The coolest part? The idea for this video game was so good that random musicians went out of their way to make their own fan original soundtrack to complement the art, which is what you're hearing right now in this portion of the video. This video game artist calls themselves Hoshi Backyard. Hoshi's fake game/world is called Lost Property. The basic gist of the story involves a schoolgirl investigator that explores supernatural phenomena called lost properties, and supposedly neutralizes those that pose a threat. While the plot isn't clear-cut since we only get pieces of the story throughout these drawings, the onus is on these few drawings to flesh out that world as much as possible, which I think Hoshi does by making them dense enough to fill in the imaginary gameplay ourselves. Speaking of gameplay, just from a glance, you can see its similarities to games like Persona. The school setting, the free roaming, the choices with consequences, pretty basic, but similarities nonetheless. The combat engagement with the supernatural seem more akin to Resident Evil, especially with the behind-the-shoulder camera with a flashlight and a gun. I'm honestly convinced the game actually exists and we're just looking at screenshots, especially since it has that lower resolution outlines that PS2 games would have. Very convincing stuff. Looking into other details, I think I and a lot of other people take for granted the artistic intent that goes into the layout of a user interface and menus. Looking specifically at the UI, you'll see that Hoshi has these little touches that add to the illusion of Lost Property being a game. There's a classic above view map, there's the little thought bubbles to show that a person is interactable, and there's a little list of quests on the side, big enough to read but small enough to not clutter the screen. It's a very clean look. As for menus, here's a drawing of what the items would look like. I'm gonna keep simping for it, but I think Persona 5 was the first game that really made me pay attention to text-to-image graphic designs. And this not being a real game only enunciates its importance. The question I think that's being asked with graphic design is, how do you communicate and display information concisely without compromising aesthetic appeal? Well, I think Hoshi's got that down pat. Looking at the colors in this world, you'll probably notice that most of it's pale greens and grays, and doesn't really stand out in any way. But to me, I think this actually becomes a strength. Yes, the tamer shades add to this grim, darker tone, but what's cool about it is the moment that Hoshi deviates from these colors, it flushes the environment with life and vibrancy. I mean, just get a feel for this particular drawing in contrast to the muted colors from earlier. That's good stuff. Looking at their past, Hoshi did video game-like art well before this. It looks like they did Breath of the Wild and Dark Souls parodies, combined with different series, and again, you can basically see downstream what led to the conception of Lost Property. I personally always enjoy seeing how artists got to the point that they are now, and Hoshi's past totally makes sense to get to this point. Okay, one last thing before I wrap this up. I don't know why, but there's one particular scene Hoshi drew that I wanted to pay homage to. And to do that, I wanted to try my hand at capturing the atmosphere of it, and that'll be at the end of this video, so stick around for that. Overall, Hoshi's aesthetic has both an eerie but light energy to it. To tell a story and leave room for the imagination the way Hoshi has shows off their creativity in a really cool way, and I can't wait to see what other stuff they'll make. Who knows, maybe one of their ideas are gonna get picked up by someone, and it'll actually become a real game. So yeah, that's 3 Japanese Twitter artists that I really like. There's nothing really deep with this video, but I just wanted to do a brief video about some cool artists. I use Twitter to find artists with stories or drawings that tell stories, and I hope you guys engage with social media in the same healthy way too. Anyways, that's all I've got. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.